Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Alexander Audio, and today my guest is Imogen Ragone, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And we're going to talk today about Alexander Technique negative directions, or sometimes they're called inhibitory directions. And Imogen, welcome to the show.
Oh, very glad to be here, Robert.
So, Imogen, I know that you've been exploring negative directions in your own teaching and for yourself for the last few weeks, and I thought it would be interesting to get some of your impressions about their usefulness or questions that have come up in terms of just how they work or aspects of them.
Sure.
And I know that you mentioned in a email to me, I believe this morning, that you had helped a woman with her breathing using negative directions. Could you maybe start with that?
Sure. Well, you had mentioned in your last podcast, the one that you did with Amy Ward Brimmer, about using the negative direction, I'm not breathing, which of course needs some explaining. We're obviously not asking our students to hold their breath in any way. It's more to do with that we're not controlling our breathing in any way. We're giving up that. That's how I'm thinking of it.
Yeah.
That we're just letting that process. It's encouraging that process just to go on its own as it would without us interfering in any way.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I had a student earlier this week who, while she was on the table, and I've usually with my students, I've maybe done a little bit of, you might call it body mapping or anatomy with breathing, helping them understand how the ribs are involved and the diaphragm, but it felt like she was sort of on the table, like forcing her breathing. There was like a lot of noise, and it just seemed like it wasn't very. And so I just thought, well, this seems like a perfect opportunity to have her try working with this direction. So I asked her to think, and I explained a bit about it. I asked her to think, I'm not breathing. And her breathing just absolutely calmed down. It quietened. It just was easy. It was lovely.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, I actually used it again with a student this morning who it wasn't quite as extreme an example, but it helped her a lot too.
Yeah.
It just seems to. I think sometimes maybe and this is the good thing about these negative directions, is sometimes, and I've done it myself, is that we get a direction and we want to really go with it. So we're noticing those ribs move and we're really sort of getting into it, or whatever the direction is, we can really do it.
Right.
And of course that's not what we want. And that's the beauty of these negative directions. It's hard to overdo it. I'm not doing something.
It is hard to overdo. I think even with even negative directions, which I think are really a cut above regular ones, and but some of the same traps are there.
Yes,
it's not like you suddenly found the ultimate way of
no, it's not
teaching, but they're easier to use for people, and they're, as you say, people are less likely to try to overdo them. There's kind of hard to overdo a no
it
statement.
It does seem to me, and maybe I can have your take on it, that there's kind of two types of negative directions.
Mm-hmm.
There's a negative direction that is actually telling yourself really what you don't want. Like, for instance, if I said to myself, I'm not tightening my neck, that's
Right.
because I do not want to tighten my neck. That is
Right.
absolutely what I. But we can also use them sort of like the I'm not breathing. We weren't saying I don't want to breathe. We do want to breathe. We just don't want to be managing it and doing it in our habitual way.
Exactly.
And that seems to me more similar to if you sort of said to yourself, I'm not getting out of the chair, or I'm not walking. And it's really a sort of shorthand in that case for saying I'm not doing that particular activity in my habitual way. Is that
Exactly. That's
yeah,
exactly how I see it. That it's you're basically telling your the lower level processes in your system, maybe if you want to put it this way, figure out another way to do
mhm.
whatever it is. And I use walking a lot with my students because
Yeah,
it's they
I have
walk into my studio, they walk out. Most people walk a bit during the day, and I find it's just an incredibly useful activity within which to explore these ideas. And I think anyone who listens could just could easily experiment with while they're walking. Occasionally say to themselves, "I'm not walking," and see if they notice a difference. And I pretty much always notice a difference right away.
I certainly I've experiment with that with myself while I am walking. I'm
Hmm.
usually on my daily walk,
Right.
and I usually feel or notice, maybe I should say, that something frees up when I think
Yeah.
that. I've used it in group classes when we've done a bit of walking,
Hmm.
and had people experiment with it, and I have a sort of mixed results, if you want to call it that. Some people report that they really felt like they were just walking in a different way, or it was felt lighter or easier or something like that, which is, of course, exactly what we're looking for.
Hmm.
Um, it felt like some people didn't know what to do with it, um, even though I sort of explained. Um, this is not about not walking.
Right.
um, uh,
Well, it
and
reminds me a little of the way some teachers in England, when I was there, would teach. Particularly, I'm thinking of Patrick MacDonald, who would get you in and out of a chair, and you'd be standing there, and you say, "Okay, I forget his exact words, but he say, I'm gonna I'm going to get you to sit in the chair, but you're going to say no, you
mm,
know." And I think he was trying to get at that same thing.
yeah,
The thing is that if you understood the game as a student, you could really just say no and not move anywhere. And of course, you didn't want
yeah,
that either. And I think I think he was in a way that I think is less efficient than just straight negative directions, getting at that same idea. And by the way, the kind of current popularity or growing popularity of negative directions, I think, owes a lot to Missy Vinyard in
oh,
her book,
absolutely. That's where I first came across them,
right?
and I love her book. So
But
yeah,
uh, but we can find you can certainly find elements of it in Alexander's writing. I just
of
came
course.
across one of his aphorisms, and I think he's quoting a student, but the quote is, um, "I see at last that if I don't breathe, I breathe."
That's lovely.
I mean,
Yes.
that is it in a nutshell. And I think that Alexander, I think he just didn't quite get to the point where he made negative or inhibitory directions explicitly a major part of his teaching, and so they kind of, in a way, it kind of got lost, maybe. And I
Well, I,
think Missy has, she brought it
mhm.
back, and most of the teachers that I've talked to who kind of learned about these on their own and are using them uh, will say I pretty much use them all the time now with my teaching. I can see why some people can get confused, particularly in a group
Yeah,
situation.
in a group, and of course, it's always I always put it out there that we're just experimenting this,
Right.
and it's just to sort of notice if it has an effect or not. You know.
Exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. And I think I know that when I've worked with groups and introduced negative directions, I have to do a little preparation for it, and I have to really, when someone seems to be having a little problem with it, I will ask them specifically, well, what were you just thinking? And a lot of times they will say something that indicates pretty clearly that whatever they were thinking, it was not what you
Yeah.
asked them to. I mean, that's
Yeah.
true of directions in general. That's not
Absolutely. Yeah.
unique. And it's just, it's worth it for everyone in the group to hear that and say, okay, we'll see how easy it is to slip into something else
Hmm.
that may seem like. So, for example, if I say, well, as you walk, think about, just say to yourself, I'm not tensing my neck. And then I ask, what were you thinking? Oh, I was really focusing on relaxing my neck.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that is
So they
kind
weren't
of
actually even doing
right.
things.
And so what I do is I write out on a blackboard the phrase, I am not, put a dash, my dash. And then you can fill in the blanks. And I'll ask people in the group to suggest possibilities, and we'll run down. You can easily come up with a dozen for the first blank: tightening, tensing, squeezing. My favorite these days is compressing.
Ah,
I'm not compressing myself. I find that's incredibly useful self-direction.
yeah, that's
Somehow
interesting.
the word compressing, it has, for me anyway, it's got a slightly different effect than I'm not tensing myself. And I've been using it in swimming a lot also, which
Ah,
is really, really fun.
it's interesting for me working with negative directions around my neck because my neck has always, I mean, it's why I started Alexander Technique
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
neck pain and tension.
Right.
So it is rather a trigger area, if we can call it that.
Yeah.
Even thinking I'm not tensing my neck, it's okay, but I don't even like the word tense to be. It's almost like I can get just drawn into that word tense. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and and
Um,
and that's why you should. It's.
but yeah,
I
and
tell people have a gigantic bucket full of options
so I've
that they
I've
can
really
use.
kind of come to think like I was thinking like I'm not doing anything with my neck.
Hmm.
But that's sort of a bit long. Um,
Hmm.
that seemed
How
helpful.
about
And
squeezing? Have you
uh,
tried squeezing?
yeah, but
You know, like
squeeze can be too. Again, it's like something I might try and, or I've got too much of a tendency to want to do.
how about
Um,
compressing? Try that
yeah, I'll
one.
try that.
I'm
But
not compressing my neck.
I've actually like, I'm not using my neck,
Hmm.
which is not true.
Well, it falls
But
into that other category
yeah,
of saying no to the
yeah,
activity.
that
Yeah,
seems from,
yeah,
so it's, again, it's all experimenting with those words that are most helpful to whatever individual is using them.
exactly. And I think one of the great strengths of negative directions is that it's once the student kind of gets it and has a few good experiences, you can kind of set them free to figure out their own ones. I mean, there's uh, as I said before, I like my students to have a gigantic bucket full of possible directions.
Hmm.
That because at any point in time, sometimes you might be in a situation where you just don't want to do a lot of thinking about what the most useful direction is. You just like to grab from a small collection of standbys.
Yes, yes.
But there are times when you have the leisure to give a little thought to what you're noticing about yourself and tailor your direction. But as long as you're clear about the general framework, and I really think that I am not statement at the beginning is crucial, um, and also my, the my at the end. Although you could have something like what you were talking about with your neck, I'm not doing anything.
Hmm.
That's a great one for constructive rest. I'm not doing anything, or
Hmm.
even I'm not doing.
Yeah.
You know,
And I've tried, I think you mentioned this in your last interview, is I'm not lying
I'm
down,
not lying on the
which was,
table. Yeah.
or I'm not lying on the, and that, I was kind of, well, I never, but it, it did let something go. It was very interesting.
And that comes
Yeah.
directly from Missy's book.
Uh-huh.
And for a long time after I was exploring negative directions, I didn't use that one because myself I hadn't really noticed anything from it. And whereas the breathing, I immediately got good results. But I did give a workshop recently, and I thought, well, some people asked about sleeping and whatever. And I thought, well, why don't I just see what happens? So I threw that one out. I said, try that tonight when you're in bed. And people came back with the most amazing stories about
Huh.
how they felt like they were floating in air. And I thought, okay, just because
Yeah.
I'm not that sensitive to it myself, I'm becoming a little more, but
But it could also be because you don't need it in the same way that
could
some,
be. Although I still have some hidden tensions there. But
no.
yeah, I know it seems impossible after all these years. But anyway, yeah, I just think negative directions just open up all kinds of possibilities, and I think they're very empowering for students because
Mhm.
the students, like, I hardly ever have a student who doesn't leave after the first lesson without at least one or two negative directions that they can start to use as they walk out the door. Now, sometimes they'll come back for the second lesson and they'll have complicated them in some way, just as with any kind of
Sure.
direction. But I'd say the rate of complications is lower with negative directions, and
Yeah.
they're just, I don't know, I find my students really like them in a way that I have to say I didn't get that enthusiasm earlier with suggesting that students self-direct. It was more they would come
Interesting.
to a lesson to get fixed, which I would discourage them from doing, but some did. And now I don't find that's how it plays out anymore. They come wanting more ideas for self-directing. They still like the hands-on work. I mean, I do
Mhm.
all the traditional stuff, but their real passion these days is how can I refine this? What are some other options? How can I use it in this situation? And that's to
Yeah,
me a very different
that's
kind
great.
of
Yeah.
teaching, and it's
Mhm.
exactly what I want to be doing because I don't
Mhm.
want people to just come and get fixed up.
Absolutely, I'm with you there. One other thought occurred to me is the sort of the way we think
Hmm.
the any direction actually, but maybe uh, I don't know whether it's especially the not direction, um, but to just I mean, Missy Vineyard talks about um, placing it in this sort of area at the front of your
Hmm.
um, which I, interestingly, I had a lesson with her at the AGM in Las Vegas last summer,
Hmm.
and we found that I was using my neck, strangely enough, to go up to my attic, as she calls this
Uh-huh.
place, you
Uh-huh.
know. So I was trying, hopefully just a little bit, but um,
Yeah.
but I find it more useful just to or at least initially, just to sort of ask people to think it very sort of lightly or gently, that
Yes.
we're
Yeah.
not judging afterwards how well we did or not, or which is different from noticing. Um,
Right. Right.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I try to
think
I
about
try to
that.
frame everything pretty
Mm,
much as an experiment. Let's just see what happens. And if you get a good result, you might want to use it again sometime. And over time, you're going to learn what works and what doesn't. But yeah, I agree that any directions, whether they're just classic Alexander ones or negative ones, um, the lighter they're delivered, as it were, the better. I spend a lot of time working with students, usually right in the first lesson or two, with the whole issue of lightness.
mm,
And because in our society, people generally things that we think about lightly are kind of vague things, like what a nice day it is today. And anything very specific tends
ah,
to be more of a concentration. You see the little
yes.
furrows in the
Uh-huh.
forehead, and kind of a fixing on something. And I say this is not something to fix on. This is something to gently ask yourself and to absolutely know ahead of time that you're going to forget it almost right away. Don't worry about that. That is not a failure. But when you notice that you've forgotten it, just gently bring it back again. So
That's nice.
I tell people ahead of time, forgetting it, forgetting what your intention was and noticing that, that's a huge success because now you have a choice point, and you can just bring it back very lightly. So there's not really a failure option built into that system,
Yeah.
you know.
And I think this sort of light thinking
Hmm.
almost does go to this place that Missy's talking about
Hmm.
when we're thinking light. It just happens.
And she's really talking about the front of the
Prefrontal
prefrontal
cortex, is it?
cortex, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, don't ask me too much about the anatomy of it.
Yeah.
That's not
But
my forte.
yeah. Well, anything else you want to say about negative directions?
I think we've covered quite a lot. I think we're good.
Excellent. Well, anyone out there, student or teacher, give it a try. In the earlier interview with Amy, I went into a little more detail with them, and this interview will be posted right below that, so you'll be able to learn pretty much all you need. And I certainly recommend buying Missy's book. It's an excellent,
Absolutely.
it's an excellent introduction to the technique on many levels. But one of them is this whole area of negative directions, which she kind of sneaks in there. She doesn't really make a big deal of it in a way, but there it is. So, Imogen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, you're very welcome. This was good.